Do you know what freedom smells like? It smells like freshly printed paper and the faint chemical scent of toner from a high-end office printer. It's the smell of a mortgage pre-approval document. For 10 years, my entire life had been a calculation, a relentless march toward a single number. And today, sitting in that ridiculously cold office in downtown Austin, I had finally hit it. I had won. Mr. Henderson slid the folder across the polished mahogany. His suit was a shade of gray that probably had a name like Corporate Certainty. Congratulations, Ms. Davis, you're pre-approved. The words were simple, mundane, but in the sterile air of that office, they sounded like a choir of angels. He was smiling, but his eyes were already looking past me, probably to his next appointment, his next commission. It didn't matter. He was just the messenger. I picked up the top sheet of paper, the official letterhead feeling impossibly heavy in my hands. I skimmed the legalese, my eyes hunting for the numbers I already knew by heart. The loan amount, the interest rate, fixed for 30 years. And there, at the bottom, the monthly payment. It was a terrifyingly large number, but I just smiled. What does a decade of your life look like on paper? For me, it looked exactly like this. Manageable. Planned. Mine. For 10 years, my world had been a landscape of no. No, I couldn't go on that trip to Bali. No, I couldn't afford that trendy restaurant everyone was talking about. No, I couldn't buy the new laptop until my current one literally sparked and died. Every freelance design project, every late night fueled by burnt coffee, every invoice chased for weeks. It all funneled into a high-yield savings account I nicknamed the Escape Pod. My friends, with their salaried jobs and predictable lives, didn't quite get it. They saw my freelance career as a bohemian dream, all creative freedom and working from coffee shops. They didn't see the 3 a.m. panic when a client disappeared without paying, or the constant gnawing insecurity that this month's feast could be next month's famine. I wasn't a bohemian, I was a soldier, and this pre-approval was my declaration of peace. I could already see the apartment in my mind. It was a small studio in a converted warehouse building in East Austin, the kind of place that cost a fortune per square foot. It had a massive, floor-to-ceiling window that looked out over the city, concrete floors, and a small nook by the window that was perfect for my drafting table. It was just enough space for one person. For me. A fortress of solitude built with my own 2 hands. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat, bringing me back to the chilly office. So, once you make an official offer and it's accepted, we can lock in this rate and move forward with the full application. I nodded, folding the paper carefully as if it were a sacred text. I understand. Thank you, Mr. Henderson. You have no idea what this means. He gave another polite, distant smile. Oh, I'm sure he had some idea, but he couldn't possibly know the specifics. He couldn't know that this wasn't just about owning property. It was about owning my own life. I grew up in a family of big dreamers, artists who lived on passion and whimsy and the naive belief that things would just work out. They were wonderful, loving people, but they were chaotic. Their lives were a storm, and I had learned from a very young age how to be the anchor. The responsible one. The one who planned. This apartment was the end of that. It was a line drawn in the sand. It was my own, quiet, stable shore, far away from the family tide. It was proof that my way, the slow, grinding, pragmatic way, worked. I didn't need a flash of genius or a lucky break. I just needed a plan and the discipline to see it through. This document was the ultimate validation of my entire existence. Walking out of the high-rise and into the blistering Texas sun, the city looked different. The traffic on Congress Avenue wasn't an annoyance, it was a vibrant hum. The skyscrapers weren't oppressive, they were monuments to ambition. My ambition. I held the folder to my chest like a shield. For the first time in my 34 years, I felt completely, utterly, and unshakably safe. I had built my life brick by brick, invoice by invoice, and now, finally, I was about to walk through my own front door. Nothing could possibly go wrong. The euphoria of the drive home was so thick I could have bottled it. Every green light felt like a personal nod from the universe. I floated up the 3 flights of stairs to my rented apartment, the space feeling smaller, more temporary than ever before. It was just a holding pattern, a place I was passing through on my way to my real life. The pre-approval folder sat on my kitchen counter, a pristine white monument to my decade of discipline. I kicked off my shoes and sifted through the mail the postman had shoved through the slot. The usual suspects: a credit card offer addressed to current resident, a flyer for a pizza place, a utility bill. And then, at the bottom of the pile, a crisp beige envelope with a window. The return address was in a formal, sans serif font, U.S. Department of Education. It had been forwarded from my parents' address in San Antonio. A yellow sticker with my Austin address was slapped crookedly across the front. A flicker of annoyance, nothing more. What now? My own student loans were a distant memory, a dragon I had slain 7 years ago with a final triumphant payment. I had the confirmation letter filed away somewhere. This had to be a mistake, some bureaucratic ghost in the machine. I tossed the rest of the mail onto the counter and slit the envelope open with my thumb, my mind already drifting back to paint swatches for my future studio. The paper felt thin and cheap, belying the weight of the words printed on it. My eyes scanned the text, snagging on phrases that didn't belong in my world. Notice of default. Immediate action required. Failure to respond. And then, a number that made the air leave my lungs in a silent rush. $80,000. Plus accrued interest and penalties. What kind of sick joke was this? This wasn't just a mistake. It was an absurdity. Then I saw the names. The first one was expected. A sudden cold knot forming in my stomach. Borrower, Jacob Davis. My brother. But it was the second name, printed with sickening clarity right below his, that stopped my heart. Cosigner, Anna Davis. My name. The room went silent, the triumphant hum of the city outside fading into a dull roar in my ears. The pre-approval letter, my ticket to freedom, was still on the counter just inches away. It looked like a relic from another lifetime. My blood turned to ice water. Cosigner? A ghost of a memory surfaced, fuzzy and distant. Me, at 22, fresh out of college and terrified. Jake, at 20, beaming with the invincible arrogance of a kid just accepted into his dream art school, a financial aid office, a man in a cheap suit. Papers to sign. Just a formality, someone had said. My parents, beaming with pride. It was a single moment, a flick of a pen 12 years ago. How could a ghost from the past reach out and strangle the present? My gaze drifted back to the yellow forwarding sticker on the envelope. This wasn't the first letter. This was just the first one to find me. They had been arriving for months, maybe longer, at my parents' house. They had been piling up, unanswered, while I was meticulously planning my future, completely oblivious. The cold knot of dread in my stomach tightened into a fist of pure ice. They knew. While I was celebrating my victory, they knew I was already in a prison I hadn't even seen. My phone felt like a block of ice in my hand. My thumb hovered over Jake's contact photo, a ridiculously pretentious black and white shot of him staring into the middle distance. How many times had I called this number to celebrate a new client, to complain about a deadline, or just to hear a familiar voice? Now I was dialing a number that felt like it belonged to a stranger, a criminal who had stolen my future. It rang 4 times, each tone a hammer blow against my skull. "Hey, Annie, what's up?" His voice was a sunbeam cutting through my dark cloud of panic. It was so light, so utterly normal, that for a split second I questioned my own reality. Maybe I had imagined the letter. Maybe this was all a stress-induced hallucination. But the cheap paper was still sitting on my counter, a venomous snake coiled in the heart of my dream. "Jake," I said, my own voice sounding tight and foreign. "I need to talk to you about something." "Ooh, sounds serious," he chirped, and I could hear the clink of glasses in the background. Was he at a bar? On a Tuesday afternoon? "Did you finally decide to quit the grind and become a world-famous painter like your brilliant younger brother?" His laugh was airy, untroubled. The sound of a man without a single financial care in the world. The sound of a man whose sister had always been the anchor. "No, Jake. I got a letter today from the Department of Education." The silence on his end was brief, but it was a different kind of silence. Not confusion. Recognition. "Oh," he said, the single syllable heavy with annoyance, not alarm. "That. Have you ever had a word hit you with physical force?" That. He called the $80,000 bomb that had just detonated in my life. That. As if it were a misplaced sock or an overdue library book. "Yes, Jake. That. It says there's a defaulted loan. For $80,000. With my name on it as the cosigner." "Yeah. I've been meaning to look into that," he said, his voice dropping into a more serious but still strangely detached register. "It's a whole bureaucratic mess. I thought I had it on a forbearance plan. You know, for economic hardship. Times are tough for artists right now, Annie. You know how it is." He said this as if he were explaining a complex artistic theory, as if his financial negligence was a profound statement on the struggle of the creative class, not just a failure to pay his bills. My grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles were white. 10 years of my life. 10 years of scrimping, saving, and sacrificing. 10 years of being the responsible one so he could be the creative one. And his excuse was that times were tough? "A forbearance plan, Jake? This letter says the loan has been in default for months. They don't send letters like this for a simple paperwork mix-up." "Why didn't you tell me? Why have they been sending them to mom and dad's?" "Look, I was going to handle it." His voice finally gained some heat, the irritation of a man being bothered with trivialities. "I just landed a commission for a new series. It's going to be huge. Once that money comes in, I'll get it all sorted out. I promise." It was the same promise I'd heard for 12 years. The big break was always just around the corner. The masterpiece was always one brush stroke away. It was a promise made of smoke. "Don't worry about it, okay? I'll make some calls tomorrow. Gotta go. I'm in the middle of something." And just like that, he hung up. The line went dead, leaving only a dial tone and the deafening silence of my apartment. I looked from the useless phone in my hand to the pre-approval letter on the counter. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't even scared. The most terrifying part of the whole conversation was the realization that he truly, honestly believed this wasn't his problem to solve. It was just an inconvenience he expected someone else to handle. He expected me. Hanging up on Jake felt like severing a limb. The silence that flooded my apartment was heavier, more profound than before. It wasn't just quiet, it was an absence of reason, of responsibility, of sanity. My mind raced, trying to find a foothold in the swirling chaos. There was only one place to turn. One number that had always been my emergency contact. My true north. My mother. My fingers were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. She picked up on the second ring, her voice the familiar, warm melody of my childhood. "Annie, honey, I was just thinking about you." Her cheerfulness was a punch to the gut. How could her world be so bright while mine was collapsing into a black hole? "Mom," I started, my voice cracking. "Mom, something's happened. I got a letter. About Jake's student loan." There was a pause. It was only a second long, but it contained a universe of unspoken knowledge. In that single, breathtaking second, I knew the answer before I even asked the question. Have you ever felt the ground disappear from beneath your feet? "What kind of letter, sweetie?" she asked, her voice now laced with a careful, rehearsed caution. "The kind that says $80,000 are past due. The kind with my name on it," I choked out. "Mom, did you know about this?" I heard a muffled sound, the phone being passed. Then my father's voice, trying to be the calm baritone of reason. "Annie, listen. A few letters have come here. Yes. We didn't want to tell you because we didn't want to cause you any unnecessary stress. You've been working so hard for that down payment." Unnecessary stress? My entire future was on a collision course with a freight train, and they thought the knowledge of it was unnecessary stress? The patronizing kindness of his words was more infuriating than an outright lie. "Not stress you out?" My voice rose, a hysterical edge creeping in. "Dad, this isn't about stress. This is a notice of default. This could ruin my credit, destroy everything I've worked for the last 10 years. Why would you hide this from me?" I was pacing now, a caged animal in my soon-to-be former life. The white folder on my counter seemed to mock me, a symbol of a future that had just been stolen. "We didn't want to put any more pressure on Jake," my mother's voice returned, soft and pleading. "He's in a very important creative period right now, honey. This new series he's working on. It's his big break. We can feel it. A distraction like this, the worry about money, it could have derailed him completely. It would have crushed his artistic spirit." The words hung in the air, so absurd, so profoundly unjust that I couldn't breathe. They had weighed my financial survival against his artistic mood, and I had lost. It was then that I finally understood. I wasn't just the anchor, I was the seawall. I was the one built to absorb the blows, to take the damage, to protect the precious, fragile thing inside. My entire life had been a training exercise for this exact moment. All my planning, my saving, my responsibility. It wasn't for me. It was to ensure I was strong enough to bear the weight of their collective irresponsibility when the time came. I wasn't a daughter. I was a contingency plan. "We thought he would handle it on his own," my dad added, his voice full of a sincerity that made me want to scream. "Just be gentle with him, Annie. He needs our support, not our judgment. You're the strong one. You always have been." The call ended a few moments later, with their gentle platitudes and my stunned silence. I stood in the middle of my living room, the letter in one hand and the phone in the other. I had called them for help. Instead, they had handed me a shovel and pointed to my brother's mess, making it clear it was my job to start digging. I was utterly and completely alone. Sleep is a luxury you can't afford when your world is on fire. I spent the night staring at the ceiling, my mind a torture chamber of cascading numbers. $80,000, 10 years, 34 years old. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the deed to my studio apartment turning to ash. By morning, a desperate, flimsy hope had taken root in the ruins of my panic. Maybe it wasn't on my credit report yet. Maybe it was a slow-moving bureaucratic beast. Maybe if I got ahead of it, I could explain. I called Mr. Henderson's office with a voice I barely recognized, a high, thin version of my own, brittle with forced cheerfulness. "Hi, it's Anna Davis," I chirped. "I just have a quick question about my pre-approval. Something came up, a small administrative thing from an old family account, and I wanted to make sure we're still on track." I sounded like I was reporting a typo, not a financial apocalypse. "Of course, Ms. Davis. Can you come in this morning? Say, 10:30? His voice was still professionally pleasant. He didn't know. The hope flickered a little brighter. Walking back into that office was a surreal experience. It was the exact same room where I had experienced the purest triumph of my life less than 24 hours earlier. But today, it felt like a courtroom. The air was still cold. The mahogany table still gleamed, but a sinister quality now clung to everything. I sat in the same chair, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap my knuckles were bloodless. Mr. Henderson entered with my folder and that same polite smile. "So, what's this little hiccup?" My carefully rehearsed speech came tumbling out, a jumble of half-truths and desperate downplaying. "It's a co-signed student loan for my brother from over a decade ago. I just received a notice. Apparently, there's been a mix-up with his payments and it's become delinquent. I'm in the process of clearing it up right now, but I wanted to be fully transparent." I tried to make it sound like I was in complete control, like this was an annoying errand, not a catastrophe. Mr. Henderson's smile didn't vanish, but it tightened at the edges. The professional warmth in his eyes was replaced by a guarded neutrality. He folded his hands on the table. "A delinquent co-signed loan," he repeated, the words sounding far more ominous in his measured tone. "That can be a significant issue, Ms. Davis. The lender sees no distinction between the primary borrower and the cosigner. To them, it's your debt." He turned to his computer. "Let me pull your credit report again, just to see if it's showing up yet." The sound of his fingers tapping on the keyboard was the only noise in the room. It was a death knell. Click, click, click. Each tap was a nail in my coffin. I watched his face, searching for any sign, any flicker of emotion. For a long moment, there was nothing but the quiet hum of the computer. Then, his eyebrows drew together slightly, his jaw tensed. He stopped typing and stared at the screen, his expression slowly morphing from neutral assessment to something grim. He knew. He swiveled his chair back to face me, and for the first time, he wouldn't quite meet my eyes. He looked at a point just over my shoulder as he spoke. "Well, Anna, it's here. The defaulted loan was reported by all 3 credit bureaus. It's dropped your credit score by over 150 points." He finally looked at me, his face a mask of professional regret. The room began to spin, the walls closing in. The numbers he was saying were abstract, but the meaning was brutally clear. "I'm very sorry, Anna," he said, his voice gentle but absolute. "But with a recent major delinquency and a score in this range, you are now considered a high-risk borrower. There isn't a lender in the country who would approve you for a mortgage." He closed the folder on his desk, a symbolic gesture that felt like a door slamming shut in my face. The white folder. My dream. "The pre-approval," he said, each word a perfectly polished stone dropped on my heart, "is rescinded." My future, which had been so clear and bright just yesterday, had just been officially, irrevocably, canceled. The 2-hour drive from Austin to my parents' house in San Antonio was a journey into the past. Every familiar exit sign, every stretch of hill country landscape was a reminder of the life I had worked so hard to escape. Not because it was bad, but because it was a comfortable trap. Today, I wasn't going home for a holiday or a nostalgic visit. I was going to war. I had demanded this meeting, this family council, and the silence in my car was the calm before the storm. They were all waiting in the living room, the same room where I'd opened Christmas presents and had my high school graduation party. The air was thick with a forced casualness that was more suffocating than open hostility. Jake was slouched in the armchair, pointedly examining a loose thread on the upholstery. My mother was fluttering around, offering iced tea. My father stood by the fireplace, his arms crossed, trying to project an aura of patriarchal calm. It was a perfectly staged scene of denial. I didn't sit down. I stood in the middle of the room and placed a thin folder on the coffee table. It contained the default notice and the letter from Mr. Henderson rescinding my pre-approval. "I'm not here for iced tea," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm here to show you what you've done." I laid it all out, the cold, hard facts. The 10 years of work. The perfect credit score, now destroyed. The studio apartment that was mine yesterday, and a fantasy today. I told them the exact number my score had dropped, 150 points. Jake wouldn't look at me, his gaze fixed on that imaginary thread as if it were the most fascinating object in the world. My mother's face crumpled with a practiced performative sorrow, but it was my father who spoke first, his voice reasonable, as if we were discussing a leaky faucet. "All right, Anna, we hear you. You're upset, and you have every right to be. But let's not be dramatic. We're a family. We'll figure this out." He was trying to manage the situation, to reduce my life's work to a manageable family problem. That's when he made his proposal, the one that proved he hadn't heard a single word I'd said. "Maybe you can start paying a little," he suggested, looking at his hands. "Just enough to get them off your back. And when Jake sells his next big series, and we all know he will, he'll pay you back every single cent. With interest if you want." He looked at Jake for confirmation, but my brother just shrugged. A silent, petulant king absolving himself of all responsibility. The offer was so insulting, so completely detached from my reality, it was like being slapped. My mother, sensing my fury, rushed in to soften the blow with a dose of emotional poison. "He has nothing, Annie," she whispered, her eyes pleading. "You know he puts every penny into his art, but you have a stable income. You're so good with money." She reached out to touch my arm. "You're the strong one. You always have been. You wouldn't let your own brother drown, would you?" And there it was. Not a question. A statement. An invoice for a lifetime of being the responsible one. They hadn't just hidden the letters. They had been waiting for me to find them. They had been waiting for the anchor to do its job. The drive home was a silent scream. The arguments from my parents' living room played on a loop in my head, a chorus of weaponized love and weaponized disappointment. "You're the strong one." The words weren't a compliment, they were a life sentence. Sleep was impossible. I lay in my bed staring into the oppressive darkness of my rented room, the city lights painting shifting, ghostly patterns on the ceiling. Every shadow seemed to mock me, twisting into the shape of a studio apartment I would now never own. My mind, refusing to rest, drifted backward. Not just days, but years. It snagged on a single sun-drenched afternoon 12 years ago. How could a memory buried for so long suddenly have such sharp, serrated edges? It rose from the depths of my subconscious, a ghost rattling its chains. The ghost wasn't of a person, but of a signature. My signature. A single looping stroke of a cheap ballpoint pen that had signed away a future I hadn't even begun to imagine yet. We were in a cramped beige office at the ridiculously expensive art school Jake had gotten into. I was 22, just a few months out of college myself, clutching my own degree like a shield. I felt so grown up, so worldly, because I had navigated 4 years of deadlines and exams and was now officially a graphic designer. Jake was 20, and he wasn't just a student, he was an event. His energy was a crackling, kinetic force that bent the world around him. He was going to be a great artist. Not a good artist. A great one. We all believed it. It was the central tenet of our family's religion. My parents were there, their faces glowing with a pride that was almost painful to look at. This was the culmination of their dreams, the validation of every art class, every encouraging word, every dollar spent on supplies instead of house repairs. They looked at Jake not as a son, but as a masterpiece they had created. And they looked at me, their reliable, practical daughter, as the one who would make sure the masterpiece was always safe in its frame. They were the dreamers, he was the dream, and I was the designated realist who made it all possible. A financial consultant, a man whose face I can't remember but whose cheap cologne I can still smell, slid a thick stack of papers across the desk. He droned on about interest rates and payment schedules, his words a meaningless buzz. Then he paused, tapping a specific line on the top page. "It's a substantial loan, so the school does require a co-signer. Just a small formality." That was the phrase, the hook, the 3 words that had cost me 10 years of my life. A small formality. In that moment, every head in the room turned to me. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It was an assumption as natural as breathing. My parents' eyes were full of hope and expectation. Jake shot me a brilliant, confident smile that said, "Of course you will." This wasn't a business transaction. It was a sacred duty. The talented one needed help, so the strong one provided it. That was the rule. That was the foundation upon which our entire family was built. Signing my name felt like the most natural thing in the world. It felt like love. Lying in my bed 12 years later, the truth finally crystallized, hard and cold as a diamond. The problem wasn't that Jake was irresponsible. The problem wasn't that my parents were enablers. The problem was that the system itself was rotten, and I had been its most willing and dedicated servant. That signature wasn't a mistake made in a single moment of youthful ignorance. It was the logical endpoint of my entire life's training. I hadn't been tricked. I had volunteered for the sacrifice, because I believed that was my purpose. And the ghost of that signature was here now, not to haunt me, but to finally, brutally set me free. I had spent my life operating on the currency of love and obligation. It had left me bankrupt. It was time to switch to a different currency, the cold, hard cash of legal reality. Hope was a luxury, and I was fresh out. The next morning, instead of calling my parents or my brother, I called a financial attorney whose name I found on a legal aid website. His name was Mr. Chen, and his office wasn't in a downtown skyscraper. It was in a small brick building that smelled of old paper and stale coffee. Mr. Chen was a small man with tired eyes that had clearly seen every possible variation of human folly. He didn't offer sympathy, he offered clarity, which was far more valuable. I laid out the story, my voice flat and clinical. He listened without interruption, nodding occasionally. When I finished, he looked at the default notice for no more than 10 seconds. "It's an ironclad contract, Ms. Davis," he said, his voice as dry as the dusty law books on his shelves. "You didn't co-sign a loan, you took out a loan. With your brother." He leaned forward, and for the first time, his tired eyes sharpened with focus. "The law doesn't care about intentions. It doesn't care that you were 22 or that he was the talented one. It only cares about the signature. To the Department of Education, you and your brother are a single financial entity. The debt belongs to Anna and Jacob. They will collect their money from whichever half of that entity is easier. Right now, that is you. Your options are to pay it yourself or to sue your brother to force him to pay. There is no option 3. Walking out of his office, I didn't feel despair. I felt a strange, cold calm. The last shred of hope that there was some magical loophole, some misunderstanding I could fix, was gone. And its absence was a relief. The ambiguity was over. I was no longer a daughter trying to navigate a family crisis. I was the manager of a hostile takeover of my own life. This was a project. The objective, survival. The obstacle, my family's entire belief system. I finally had a clear, defined enemy. The drive back to my apartment was no longer a journey of panic, but one of strategy. My mind, which had been a storm of emotion, was now a silent, efficient machine, processing variables and formulating a plan. What was the one thing I could demand that was both undeniably reasonable and a direct challenge to the cult of Jake's talent? It wasn't about the money, it was about reality. A job. Not a commission. Not an art grant. A job. The kind with a schedule, a boss, and a bi-weekly pay stub. I laid out the terms in my head, refining them until they were a razor-sharp weapon. I would help. I would use my organizational skills, the very skills they had always taken for granted, to navigate the bureaucracy. I would even sacrifice a piece of my savaged savings to stop the immediate bleeding. But my help was no longer a gift. It was a transaction. And my price was Jake's participation in the world the rest of us lived in. The world where talent doesn't pay the bills until it's paired with work. That evening, I called my parents' house. "Put me on speakerphone," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. "Jake, are you there?" I heard his sullen affirmative. I took a breath. "I have a proposal," I began, my tone the one I used with difficult clients. "I will contact the lender. I will help restructure this debt into a manageable payment plan. To show good faith, I will make the first payment myself to stop the default status. But I will only do any of this on one non-negotiable condition." I paused, letting the silence stretch. "Jake, you will get a job. Any job. A barista, a waiter, a retail clerk. I don't care. And you will provide me with a legally signed offer of employment before I make a single phone call." The silence on the other end of the line was a loaded weapon. I could almost hear the gears turning in their heads, the shock giving way to indignation. I had just committed the ultimate act of heresy. I had suggested that the high priest of our family religion get a job making lattes. It wasn't just a practical solution, it was a theological challenge. I had questioned the central myth that had governed our lives for 3 decades, that Jake's talent was a delicate, sacred flame that must be protected from the harsh winds of reality at all costs. Jake was the first to speak, and his voice was no longer bored or detached. It was a raw, wounded roar. "Are you kidding me? You want me to get a job at Starbucks? Do you have any idea what that would do to me? You're trying to kill my soul, Anna. That's what this is. You've always been jealous of my talent, and now you're trying to destroy it." The accusation was so absurd, so perfectly, childishly narcissistic, that it almost made me laugh. Jealous? I had been his chief financial backer, the silent, uncredited producer of his entire adult life. Before I could respond, my mother jumped in, her voice trembling with a righteous fury I had never heard before. "Anna, how could you? That is the cruelest thing you have ever said. Your brother is on the verge of a breakthrough. We can't ask him to betray his gift, to put his dreams on hold, just for a paycheck. That's not who we are. We support our artists in this family." She spoke of his gift as if it were a separate entity, a demanding houseguest for whom we all had to make sacrifices. The idea that the artist himself should be responsible for its upkeep was apparently unthinkable. My father's intervention was quieter, but somehow more devastating. He used his calm, rational tone, the one designed to make me feel like a hysterical child. "Honey, let's be practical," he said, the word a bitter irony in his mouth. "He's an artist. He doesn't have the skills for a regular job. What do you expect him to do? This ultimatum isn't helpful. It's punitive. You're punishing him because you're scared, and I understand that. But this isn't the way." It was a masterful piece of psychological jujitsu, reframing my demand for basic accountability as an emotional, irrational attack. The conversation devolved from there. It was no longer about a debt. It was about identity. My pragmatic condition was interpreted as a personal attack on Jake's very being. They saw me not as a person drowning, but as a saboteur trying to sink their prize ship. They weren't defending their son. They were defending their investment, the dream they had poured all their own frustrated ambitions into. My financial ruin was an acceptable loss to protect the narrative. My dream of a small studio apartment was nothing compared to his dream of a gallery opening. I stood in my kitchen, listening to the three of them, a united front of delusion, as they explained why my very reasonable request was actually a cruel and unusual punishment. The wall between us was no longer made of unspoken rules and quiet assumptions. It was now a fortress of open hostility. I was no longer the anchor. I was the enemy. And as they continued to rail against my soulless pragmatism, I realized something terrifying. They would let me go under. They would watch me lose everything before they would ever ask him to sacrifice anything. The argument over the phone was still raging, a chaotic 3-against-1 battle of accusations and deflections, when my cell phone vibrated in my other hand. I glanced at the screen. The number was unknown, with a toll-free area code. A cold dread, sharper and more immediate than the family drama, cut through the noise. I knew, with a primal certainty, who it was. The abstract threat of the default notice was about to become a voice. It was about to have a name. "Hold on," I said, my voice flat, cutting through my mother's tearful monologue about Jake's sensitive nature. I muted the speakerphone, leaving their circular argument to rage in a silent digital box. I took a half step into my tiny hallway, as if a few feet of distance could protect me. Then I answered the call. "Hello?" I asked, my voice a tight whisper. "Have you ever stood on a cliff edge, knowing the next gust of wind would send you over?" That was the feeling. The wind was about to blow. The voice on the other end was a machine made of flesh. It was a man's voice, but it was devoid of any human inflection. No warmth, no anger, just a monotonous, soul-crushing neutrality. "I am calling for Anna Davis," the voice stated. It wasn't a question. "This is an attempt to collect a debt, and any information obtained will be used for that purpose. Are you Anna Davis?" I swallowed, my throat dry as dust. "Yes, this is she." "Ms. Davis," the voice continued, without a flicker of acknowledgement. "I am calling from the Northwood Collections Agency regarding your defaulted Department of Education loan, account number ending in 7321. The current balance, including penalties and interest, is $87,412.16. He recited the number with the same emotional investment as if he were reading a grocery list. It was a number that represented the sum total of my nightmares, and to him, it was just a Tuesday. The world narrowed to the sound of his voice in my ear and the frantic, silent argument I could see unfolding on the muted screen of my phone. My father was gesturing wildly. My mother was wiping her eyes. Jake was staring at the ceiling, the picture of martyred genius. They were arguing about the theoretical death of his soul, while I was on the phone with the man who was about to perform the actual autopsy on my financial life. The disconnect was so profound, so utterly insane, it bordered on a dark comedy. "Our records indicate that we have made numerous attempts to contact you and the primary borrower without success," the voice droned on. "As we have now acquired this debt, we are required to inform you that if a payment arrangement is not made within the next 72 hours, we will initiate proceedings for administrative wage garnishment." Wage garnishment. The words were clinical, bureaucratic, but their meaning was brutally simple. They were going to reach directly into my bank account, into my client payments, and take what was theirs. The walls I had so carefully constructed around my life were about to be breached. 72 hours, I repeated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. My eyes were still glued to the phone screen, to the silent movie of my family imploding. They were fighting to protect an illusion. But the man on the other end of this line, this faceless voice of consequence, he didn't deal in illusions. He dealt in deadlines. The game was over. The debate was finished. The clock had just started ticking. And I had 3 days before it hit zero. 72 hours. The words echoed in the sudden, deafening silence after I hung up with the collector. 3 days. It wasn't a negotiation tactic. It was a countdown to detonation. The family argument, still flickering on my muted phone, seemed like a ridiculous puppet show from a distant planet. Their debate about feelings and artistic souls was a luxury I could no longer afford. My reality had been reduced to a single, brutal calculation: act or be annihilated. The choice was never really a choice at all. I unmuted the phone just long enough to say one sentence. "The conversation is over," I said, my voice a blade of ice. "Do not contact me." Then I hung up on my entire family. I didn't feel anger or sadness. I felt nothing at all. It was the terrifying, clarifying calm that comes after the storm has passed, and you are left standing in the wreckage. There was no one to blame, no one to appeal to. There was only the debt, the deadline, and me. My fingers, moving with an autonomy my brain hadn't yet caught up with, opened my banking app. I stared at the number in my high-yield savings account, my escape pod. 10 years of my life, digitized into a single line of green text. It was the down payment for the studio. It was the trip to Bali I never took. It was every late-night pizza I'd skipped in favor of instant ramen. It was the physical manifestation of my discipline and my dreams. And I was about to set it on fire to keep from freezing to death. With a few clinical taps, I initiated the transfer. A huge, sickening chunk of my savings, nearly 80% of it, moved from the safety of my account to the unforgiving void of my checking account, ready to be sacrificed. The number on the screen shrank, my 10-year effort reduced to a fraction of its former self in less than 10 seconds. It was the most painful thing I had ever done, but as the confirmation screen flashed, an unexpected emotion surfaced through the numbness. Not regret, but rage. A pure, cold, clarifying rage. This wasn't a sacrifice for them anymore. This wasn't me being the anchor. This was a tactical retreat. I was amputating a limb to save the body. The money was gone, but the illusion was gone with it. I was no longer propping up their fantasy world. I was paying my way out of it. And I would be damned if I was the only one who paid the price. I made the payment to the collection agency, a sum large enough to halt the garnishment, my finger stabbing the confirm button with a violent finality. Then I made my second call of the day. Back to the tired-eyed attorney, Mr. Chen. "I've made a payment to stop the garnishment," I said, my voice hard. "Now I want to retain you. I want you to draft a formal repayment agreement between myself and my brother, Jacob Davis. I want it to stipulate that he is responsible for 50% of all future payments, and if he defaults, I will sue him in civil court for the full amount I have paid on his behalf." I was no longer asking for advice. I was giving instructions. This wasn't a family squabble anymore. It was a legal proceeding. It was a declaration of war, signed not with love, but with a wire transfer receipt. The first thing you notice after you declare war on your family is the silence. It's not a peaceful quiet. It's a vacuum, an absence of noise so profound it has a physical weight. My phone, which had been a constant source of drama and dread, now lay dark and inert on the kitchen counter. No angry texts, no pleading voicemails, no calls from my mother pretending everything was fine. For the first time in my adult life, I was completely untethered from their emotional orbit, and the silence was the sound of the rope snapping. I sat on the floor of my rented apartment, the same apartment that just days ago had felt like a temporary launch pad to my real life. Now, it was just a box. The dream of the studio, with its concrete floors and city view, wasn't just delayed. It was a ghost. A phantom limb that ached with a loss so deep it felt physical. I would open my banking app and stare at the new, pathetic number in my savings account. It was a gravestone marking the death of a decade. 10 years of my life, gone in a single brutal transaction. The loneliness was a physical presence in the room, a cold draft that no closed window could stop. For days, my hand would twitch, reaching for my phone with the muscle memory of a lifetime, wanting to call my mom to tell her about a difficult client or a funny thing I saw. And each time, the realization would hit me again, a fresh punch to the gut. There was no one to call. The bridge was burned, and I was the one who had lit the match. I felt hollowed out, as if someone had reached inside me and scooped out everything that wasn't essential for basic survival. But then, in the deepest quiet of that hollowed-out space, a strange, unfamiliar feeling began to bloom. It wasn't happiness, it wasn't even peace. It was relief. A profound, bone-deep, and terrifying relief. For 34 years, I had been the anchor, responsible for holding the chaotic family ship steady in every storm. And the weight of that chain had been slowly, imperceptibly drowning me. I had just paid an impossible price, my dream and my family, but I had paid it to sever that chain. I looked around the small rented room. The dream of owning my own home was gone. The family I had known was gone. My savings were gone. I had lost almost everything. But as I sat there, surrounded by the wreckage, I knew I had gained the one thing I never even knew I was fighting for. I was no longer their anchor. I was my own lifeboat, small and battered, floating alone on a vast and empty sea. And for the first time in my entire life, I was finally, terrifyingly in charge of my own direction. I was free. A year is a strange measure of time. It's long enough to heal a wound into a scar, but short enough that you can still feel the phantom ache of the injury. For 1 year, I have been rebuilding. Not the life I had planned, but a new one, from the ground up, on a foundation of broken trust and hard-won clarity. My savings account is no longer a gravestone. It's a sapling, fragile but growing. The number is still a fraction of what it was. But now, every dollar in it feels completely and exclusively mine. I'm still in the same rented box, but it's different now. I painted one wall a deep, calming blue, an act of permanence in a temporary space. It's my home, not my holding cell. Mr. Chen sends me a brief, formal email every 3 months. It's a sterile report on the status of my agreement with Jacob Davis. The second email, 6 months ago, contained the news. Faced with the undeniable reality of a lawsuit he couldn't charm his way out of, Jake had gotten a job. Not at Starbucks. He was a junior graphic designer at a small marketing firm in San Antonio. It was the ultimate irony. He didn't have to kill his soul. He just had to use his talent to pay his bills, like every other artist on the planet who wasn't a myth. He makes the minimum payment every month, on time. The legal threat was the dose of reality our family's love could never provide. The silence from my family has been absolute. There was no angry phone call after they received the legal papers from Mr. Chen. No text on Thanksgiving. No card for Christmas. The quiet has been deafening at times, a constant reminder of the amputation, but the fear is gone. I no longer live with a low-grade hum of anxiety, waiting for the next crisis, the next demand on my strength. My phone is just a phone now, not a potential bearer of bad news. The peace I've found in their absence is a guilty, selfish, and incredibly precious thing. Then, on the morning of my 35th birthday last week, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I hadn't seen in 365 days. My mother. For a full minute, I just stared at her name on the screen, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I expected an accusation, a plea, a guilt trip. But when I finally opened it, the message was only 5 words long. Hope you're doing well? It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an admission of guilt or an olive branch. It was something far more significant. It wasn't an attack. It was a single, fragile crack in their wall of denial. It was a tiny acknowledgement of my separate existence, a whisper that suggested the painful reality of the situation was, perhaps, beginning to seep through their carefully constructed illusions. I haven't replied. I don't know if I ever will. But I know that the message wasn't for me. It was for them. It was the first, terrifying, and necessary step out of the fantasy I had to burn down to save myself.